There are people who only endure life because they believe that one day God will reward all of it. There are people who donate money to the church, not out of faith, but out of fear. Fear of an eternity in flames. It's not an exaggeration. It's real. It's everyday. It's brutal. People live unhappy, trapped in loveless marriages, in soul-crushing jobs, in routines that kill them inside. But they continue. Not out of hope, but out of fear. Fear of making a mistake, fear of burning, fear of being judged by an invisible eye that never sleeps. And at the same time, there are those who remain silent, negate themselves, kneel down, not out of faith, but because they believe it buys them a place in heaven. That their present pain will yield eternal interest, that to obey, even without understanding, will be rewarded with an eternity of peace. Jorge Luis Borges wrote this as someone spitting out a truth too ugly to be accepted. What is heaven but a bribe, and what is hell but a threat? That phrase is a direct attack on what sustains millions of minds. It's more than criticism, it's an autopsy. Because if heaven is a prize, then goodness becomes a business. And if hell is a punishment, then fear becomes morality. Think, how many people do you know who do good for fear of punishment? How many consider themselves good only because they follow rules that promise something in return? That is not virtue, it's calculation. It's spiritual blackmail. The video that begins now is not about religion, it's about power, about behavior, about how fear and desire have been used to create a system of control that seems voluntary but is not. Here, Borges' phrase will not just be analyzed. It will be dissected, tested against reality, confronted with real, sad, unbearably human examples. We are going to put morality against the wall and ask, would you still be good if no one was watching? Let's begin. There are children who don't lie out of ethics. They don't lie because someone told them that if they lie, they won't go to heaven. That is not morality, it's indoctrination. The first great perversion of goodness is born here. From a young age, thousands of people learn that being good is a means, not an end. A means to conquer something, to deserve paradise. Heaven in this model ceases to be transcendence. It becomes currency. It is this logic that Borges attacks with the phrase that structures everything. What is heaven but a bribe? He is not denying the sacred, he is denouncing the political use of the promise of the sacred. Heaven is transformed into emotional blackmail. Be good or you won't get the prize. This is not faith, it is conditioning. The psychologist Skinner explained this scientifically. He created the concept of positive reinforcement. Rewards condition behaviors. In a classic experiment, pigeons were trained to press a button. Every time they did, they received food. The behavior repeated automatically. The logic is simple. Do this, gain that, now replace the button with a prayer. Positive reinforcement is not exclusive to religion, but in many religious traditions, it is elevated to its most absolute form, eternal salvation. Millions live their entire lives waiting for a prize that will only be delivered after death and that no one has ever seen. But they still submit because they have been taught to associate obedience with the promise. This blind obedience has nothing virtuous about it. It paralyzes critical consciousness. Borges perceived it with precision. Theology is one of the forms of fantastic literature. It's not a cheap attack, it's a subtle warning. It reminds us that many doctrines are not sustained by logic, but by well-written narratives, stories that mold behavior more than any law. Stories that say, do this and you will be saved. But they never explain what you will be saved from, why, and for what purpose. Examples of this are everywhere. Women who endure abuse in silence, because God honors those who persevere. In this model, good becomes an investment. You act correctly, even if you are suffering, not because you believe in the justice of the action, but because it supposedly gives you points in the final judgment. And that is a theft of freedom, because the choice is already flawed. Virtue thus becomes accounting. And worst of all, whoever doesn't fit into this game becomes a threat. If you are not seeking heaven, then your goodness is suspicious. If you act on principles and not on promises, they say you have no faith. As if heaven were not only a prize but an obligatory condition for good to exist. Borges, who was agnostic and passionate about labyrinths, perhaps saw heaven as the most perfect of them. A labyrinth without a center. A game where the rules change, but the prize never arrives. And where the true objective is not to reach something, but to keep everyone walking in the right direction. Only the question this raises is cruel. If you only do good because you want heaven, what would you do if heaven did not exist? Faith in this model becomes an engineering of desire. And heaven, the final product of a behavior industry. But the story doesn't end there. Because if heaven is the prize, the fear of losing it has to be great enough to keep everyone in line. And that's where the second pillar of this game comes in. The fear of hell has already brought more people to their knees than the love of God. That phrase is not theoretical, it is emotional statistics. Millions of people do not pray out of gratitude, they pray out of panic. And when fear is the foundation of faith, what is built is not spirituality, it is compulsive obedience. The idea of hell is one of the most powerful inventions in human history. Not because of its existence, but because of its utility. Borges was terrified of dogmas. He knew that invisible terror was more effective than any cell. He wrote, "Hell and paradise seem to me disproportionate. The acts of men do not deserve so much." The phrase reveals the absurd. A white lie, an impure thought, a doubt, and the punishment would be eternal. Infinite punishment for a finite error. That equation is irrational, but necessary for those who want to control. The philosopher Michel Foucault called this disciplinary power. You don't need a present jailer. It is enough to believe that you are being watched all the time. Thus, you monitor yourself. You silently suppress yourself. You punish yourself even before making a mistake. That's exactly what hell offers. A distorted mirror where every desire is transformed into condemnation. Don't think, don't doubt, don't feel, don't dare. Because hell is not a place, it is a mechanism. It functions like a mental software. Installed in childhood, updated with guilt, protected by taboos, it runs in the background, influencing decisions, relationships, sexuality, career, identity, and often, without the person realizing it. Do you know someone who stopped living their own truth for fear of sinning? How many young people spend their lives hating themselves for feeling what they feel? How many people die without fulfilling themselves because doctrine convinced them that their desire belonged to the devil? Medieval theology refined hell in high resolution. Dante, in the Divine Comedy, drew 9 circles, each with specific tortures, and although it was literature, this was absorbed as dogma. Millions of faithful believe more in Dante than in the Gospels themselves. Hell became the great spectacle of fear, a pedagogy of punishment. The problem is that when someone is taught to be afraid of making a mistake, they are not being taught ethics, they are creating a submissive citizen. And here, Borges disarms us again. Guilt is perhaps the most refined form of vanity, because there is a type of faith that transforms hell into an imaginary trophy. I am saved, you are not. It is the faith that judges, excludes, condemns, always with the certainty that God is on its side. But that certainty is a poison. It inverts compassion and replaces love with spiritual hierarchy. And hell in this system ceases to be just punishment. It becomes status. Some are closer to heaven, others already have a ticket to hell, a binary, reductionist, immoral logic in its essence. In practice, this idea has destroyed lives. Children who grew up with night terrors because of sermons about demons. Women forced to silence trauma so as not to stain their testimony. This type of morality based on fear is as toxic as any authoritarian regime because it imprisons without bars, and no one escapes something that was implanted as absolute truth from the first years of life. The tragedy is that the threat of hell is accepted because it works, because we were taught that to fear is the path of wisdom. But there is a brutal difference between wisdom and submission, and perhaps the greatest gesture of faith is to reject fear. There are those who return a wallet they found on the street, even if they are atheists. There are those who save strangers in a fire without ever having prayed. What moves these people? If there is no reward, no eternal punishment, why choose good? The answer is simple and devastating. Because good can be enough by itself. Because there are those who prefer to be ethical than to be rewarded. Because there are those who have the courage to do the right thing without a divine audience. This point is a territory few tread upon. Morality without God. And here we are not talking about a teenage rebellion against religion. We are talking about a lucid adult morality that does not need celestial surveillance to exist. Jorge Luis Borges, who never openly declared himself an atheist, flirted with this idea in an elegant and dangerous way. He didn't say that God doesn't exist. He asked, what if he does exist, but he is indifferent? This hypothesis is even more radical than atheism because it breaks the idea that there is a bill to be paid. It suggests that, perhaps, everything we do here is our total responsibility. No heaven, no hell, just human consequence. Albert Camus, in his Myth of Sisyphus, states that the universe is indifferent. Life has no prefabricated meaning, but this absence of meaning does not authorize chaos. On the contrary, it obliges us to the conscious creation of meaning. In Camus' words, the absurd is born from that confrontation between the human appeal and the irrational silence of the world. This is extreme freedom and also extreme responsibility. You are good not because someone demands it, but because you decided to be. And that is more difficult because it requires reflection, it requires autonomy. Nietzsche was even crueler in this discussion. He said that Judeo-Christian values transformed the world into a theater of resentment, that good became synonymous with obedience and evil, synonymous with power. But he also believed in the creation of a new morality, not based on fear, but on affirmation. A morality of one who chooses to live fully and, even so, respect the other. These thinkers push us toward the center of the abyss. What if there is no God, no final judgment, no prize, no punishment? What is left for us? The other is left for us. Empathy is left for us. The conscious choice not to hurt is left for us. There are tribes like the Hadza in Tanzania who have no organized religion, and yet they live with strong bonds of cooperation, sharing, and respect. Because ethical behavior is not a theological invention. It is a practical necessity. It is a strategy for coexistence. The anthropologist Ruth Benedict wrote, "Morality is a custom, not a universal law. That is, good did not fall from the sky. It arose from group life, from the need for coexistence, from the pain of losing those we love. Religion organized these values, but did not invent them. When you see someone helping without a camera, without applause, without a church, without hope of heaven, there is good in its purest state, without spiritual marketing, without calculation." The philosopher Kant believed that the true moral act is one done out of duty and not out of interest. But even he clung to the idea of a rational legislator, something superior to validate justice. Perhaps the most honest proposal is that of Sartre. Man is condemned to be free, and that condemnation brings with it the weight of ethical choice. Doing good without God is not denying spirituality. It is affirming that, if God exists, he must be better than the rules invented in his name. And if he doesn't exist, then it is up to us to make the world a less hellish place, while there is still time. No empire lasted as long as the fear of hell. No army killed as much as the promise of heaven. This is a cold realization, and perhaps that is why no one wants to say it out loud. Religion did not need tanks. Pulpits were enough. It did not need bars. Sins were enough. Theology was the largest behavioral engineering project ever executed by humanity. Borges, who was obsessed with hidden systems and structures, understood this better than many historians. Order is a dream imposed on chaos, and heaven and hell were the architecture of that dream, They were the moral engineering used to sustain kingdoms, manipulate masses, extinguish identities. The Crusades were not only religious wars, they were sacred marketing missions. Thousands of men killed and died, believing they were buying paradise with every sword thrust. Pope Urban II promised total forgiveness of sins to anyone who participated in the First Crusade in 1095. That was the first militancy rewarded with heaven. Result: looting, genocides, rapes, all under the seal of holiness. In the following centuries, the same method would be replicated in other scenarios. The Inquisition tortured in the name of salvation. Black slavery was justified by European theologians as a way to baptize pagan souls. Catholic missions colonized entire cultures, promising heaven to converts and fire to resistors. Heaven became currency, hell became blackmail, and both became tools of spiritual government. The philosopher Hannah Arendt warned about the banality of evil, how absolute ideas, when institutionalized, lose their face and acquire cogs. Doctrine becomes norm, faith becomes system, hell becomes protocol. And the most perverse thing, no one feels guilty, because everything is done in the name of God. History is full of martyrs, but also of well-intentioned executioners, people who believed they were saving souls while destroying bodies. Borges again captured this with an uncomfortable lucidity. All things are words of the language in which someone, or something, writes the universe. He knew that sacred discourse could be manipulated as language, and whoever controls the language controls thought. That's what the church understood early on, and not just the Christian one. Political Islamism, Orthodox Judaism, nationalist Hinduism, all, at some point, instrumentalized the divine to guarantee obedience. Salvation became public policy. Heresy, a state crime. Faith, an arm of power. And when power wants to perpetuate itself, it needs surveillance and fear. The historian Yuval Harari, in *Sapiens*, said something brutal. You cannot control a population with violence alone. You need to convince people to monitor themselves. That is exactly what the promise of heaven and the threat of hell did. They internalized authority. You no longer need the police if you believe that sin will be eternally punished. That system is efficient because it is invisible, because it is disguised as virtue, because it doesn't look like oppression, it looks like salvation. But the consequence of this is not only historical, it is psychological, affective, existential. There are people who never forgave themselves for sins that only exist in books. People who live in permanent guilt for choices that hurt doctrines, but hurt no one. And the most tragic thing, all this sustained by a structure that claimed to love. What began as faith turned into surveillance. What promised to liberate ended up domesticating, and heaven and hell became the invisible fence of a flock that learned to walk in a circle, believing it was heading toward the light. But what if that circle is the real dungeon? And what if the promise is just that? A promise? Perhaps no one is waiting for you on the other side. No God, no judgment, no reunion, just silence. That is perhaps the most unbearable idea that has ever crossed the human mind. The nothing. Not hell, not punishment, but the total absence, the indifference of the universe, the possibility that all of this, life, guilt, glory, repentance, ends like a full stop with no ellipses, no epilogue. Nietzsche announced the death of God with an almost mournful tone. But what few understand is that he was not celebrating. He was alerting. If there is no longer God, then it is you who will have to create meaning. You will be the author, the actor, and the audience of your moral theater, and there will be no excuse. Camus goes further. If life is absurd, without ultimate meaning, without guarantees, without an afterlife, then resisting with dignity is the only possible heroism. He writes about the myth of Sisyphus. We must imagine Sisyphus happy, even pushing a useless, eternal stone, because he accepted the absurd, and by accepting, he became free. Here, heaven and hell dissolve. Fear no longer has a function. The promise loses value. We are left only with the now. With the touch of a body. With the ethical gesture that asks for nothing in return. With art, silence, choice, the instant, with love, even knowing it ends. With goodness, even if no one recognizes it. With life, even if this is all there is. This possibility is frightening because it demands maturity and because it offers no consolation. It dismisses and leaves us alone, but it also offers us something that no doctrine can honestly deliver. The truth that living well does not depend on the afterlife. If there is nothing, then heaven is not a destination. It is a way of being in the world. And hell is too. Borges perhaps knew this. That's why he wrote Labyrinths, to show that meaning is not in the exit, it is in the walking. In the end, the greatest freedom is not choosing between heaven and hell. It is not needing either of them to make life worthwhile. The final question is not about what comes next. It is about what you do while you are still here. You have made it this far. You heard everything. You thought with us. You doubted. You disagreed. You recognized yourself. And just for that, you have already helped more than you imagine. Because in a world where almost everything is a distraction, staying until the end of a video like this is resistance. It is proof that thinking still matters, that questioning remains sacred. This channel is made for that, not to deliver ready-made answers, but to challenge with difficult questions. We are interested in people who think, feel, and do not accept superficial answers. Thank you for being with us. Just by watching, liking, commenting, or sharing, this is already huge, because every person who enters this dialogue helps this message go further. You are a part of this, truly, and if heaven or hell are not certainties, at least we can build something worthwhile together here. Thank you for being here. See you in the next immersion.